In the 19th century, English textile workers took to the street. Frustrated with the implementation of automated technologies in their workforce, they engaged in numerous collective actions, going into the streets, protesting, signing petitions, and ultimately destroying some of the machines they worked with. Now known as the Luddites, these workers understood that technology is not a unidirectional vector of progress, but instead something that is rooted in social conditions and can reconfigure them. And for these workers, the technology threatened their very incomes and material conditions. Hi, my name is Freddy Reiber. Like the intro said, I'm a third-year PhD student at Boston University. I work on questions of power and technology, and recently I've been working on issues of labor, specifically organized labor, and the role that technology and the digital workspace has on organized labor. So you might be asking yourself, and this is a totally valid question, why is somebody in a computer and data science program studying organized labor? Part of the answer is that I like to think out of the box. I think my shoes maybe kind of show that off. But the more direct answer is that organized labor actually is incredibly important for establishing the working conditions that many of us now work under. Things that you might not be aware of, like the 8-hour work week, the removal of children from the labor force, or even Social Security, were developed and fought for through organized labor struggles. I think more importantly is this idea of income inequality. You'll often hear social scientists or economists talk about the income inequality problem in America, how more money is going to the wealthiest folks and less money is going to the poor folks. There's a direct correlation between labor union membership and coverage and the amount of income inequality in the United States. So I grabbed here, I think this graph came out in 2017 from the Economic Policy Institute, but it's basically a map or a graph of union membership, so the percentage of workers who are covered by union contracts, and the share of income going to the top 10%, essentially a strong metric for income inequality. I think the results are pretty startling. In the sense that union membership goes up, income inequality goes down, union membership goes down, income inequality goes up. If we were to continue this graph, and if I could stand off of the red dot, but I was told the floor is lava, I would show you that the numbers have not gotten better from 2014 onwards. Currently, we still sit at about 11% union membership coverage, and it doesn't seem to be going up anytime soon. But there's more to this data that this graph doesn't show, and it's that American workers want labor unions. In a 2021 poll, about half of American workers said that they would vote to unionize their workplace right now if given the option. And labor unions have been consistently polling in the high 60s to low 70s in approval, and all are a 70-year high. So there's this massive discrepancy. Workers, economists, social scientists think labor unions are important and we need them, but yet we don't have them. Why is this? One of the answers, or one of the potential answers, and the focus of my work recently, has been on technology. Increasingly, technology and computerized tools are revolutionizing the way that we work, but oftentimes the impacts of that are understudied. Let's take the example of a Starbucks barista. As a Starbucks barista, every time you make a transaction, you're doing that through some sort of digital tool. It could be an iPad or some other specifically more targeted market device, but each time you do that, you're creating a data point. Truck drivers, as sociologist and scholar Karen Levy talks about in her 2014 book, are under exquisite amounts of computation. All of their routes are planned, and each decision that they make on those routes is tracked. Moreover, if you're working a white-collar job, you probably just work with a computer, something that maybe 25, 30 years ago you didn't do. The impact of this is what is called a data imbalance. You've probably heard conversations about data imbalances in things like Instagram, YouTube, or TikTok. Every time you take an action on a platform, you're creating a piece of data which then companies will use to optimize their algorithms to show you content that you might want to see. That's totally fine. The issue is that this is also happening in the workforce. Corporations are increasingly using digitalized tools to optimize and reconfigure the way that we're working, but doing so has implicit or explicit, I don't know, I'm not on the design teams here, so I can't tell you if this is a design goal or not, effects on people's right to engage in their legal right to organize. One way this is happening is, like I said, a data imbalance. So all of this information that you're doing at work is then stored and used to optimize, but it can also be used to predict. Leaked documents from 2020 talked about how Amazon and Whole Foods had developed a heat map tracker to predict which stores were at a high risk of unionizing, combining their own internal data, Department of Labor data, and some active data that they collected on union statistics. They were essentially able to map out and figure out which Whole Foods were at the highest likelihood of unionizing, and then implement small little procedures to stop them. Numerous other platforms that you might just hear of as like HR tools, so Perceptix is one, have now started advertising the ability to predict which sets of workers might have union sentiment, allowing employers to quash any union drive before it starts. I think oftentimes if you listen to, say, a dispute, you'll maybe hear managers talk about how it's a free and fair election, but if you have any experience on the ground, you'll know that that's not the case. Workers are under increasingly amounts of scrutiny when it comes to enacting their legal right to organize. And as any organizer who's been in a long-scale union battle will tell you, having privacy is of the utmost importance. And when employers can predict who is going to want to unionize and who isn't, you're losing that ability to have privacy and shifting the power balance more in favor of the employers. But it gets worse than that. Sorry, this is maybe not the most optimistic talk to have at the end. But it gets worse than that. In a recent study that colleagues at Penn State, Boston University, and I conducted, we found that workers' fears go deeper than just the material realities. Michel Foucault, in Discipline and Punishment, or Discipline and Punish, talks about the panopticon, a theoretical prison in which prisoners are consistently under the risk of surveillance, but don't know if they're being surveilled. The effect is that prisoners will then self-police themselves, feeling that they might be being watched, and so they might need to act as if they're being watched at all times. Our study found that workers had the same fears when it came to organizing or using their legal right to organize. Workers would consistently report fears over the employer hacking their own phones, these are personal phones, or their emails, or snooping on private messages, be it on Instagram, Slack, or WhatsApp. The point here is that through tech obfuscation and this unknown unknown, workers don't know how they're being watched or where they're being watched, employers are able to create a culture of fear, which makes it incredibly hard for workers, again, to leverage their legal right to organize. Even when workers are not under surveillance, the same study that I conducted shows that workers have a much harder time building community and leveraging, again, their legal right to organize because of spatial and temporal constraints. In white-collar work, workers are significantly more spatially and temporally, that means physically and timed, the time dimension, separated than they have ever been. If we think about the 1930s and the strongest part of the American labor movement, unions leveraged community that they had developed through numerous potlucks, barbecues, or even baseball games, something that the remote work apparatus is not conducive to. If you're on the blue-collar side, you're probably subject to numerous scheduling algorithms that are designed to optimize to fit the demands of consumers, but the effect is that workers then have significantly more uncertain schedules, have harder schedules to manage, and again, are way more spaced out. This makes it incredibly hard to build community or to build trust, something that when you're engaging in a labor dispute is incredibly important for success. The shift in digital communication also changes access. In 2024, the New York Times Tech Workers Guild walked off the job, again, demanding better working conditions, but before they did that, they were bombarded with work messages from their employer urging them to vote no on unionizing, to vote no on striking, and then C, to scab the striking workers. They did so because so many of the tools that we use to communicate with our fellow workers are owned or maintained by a central authority figure, your employer. A sociologist working at factories noted that workers would oftentimes be bombarded with anti-union messages on their own personal phones. It's not uncommon for workers working in fulfillment centers to use their phones for interacting with orders, and those apps will then broadcast, even when you're not on work, anti-union messages to workers. Where as a union organizer, you don't have any of that ability. Employers will famously give inaccurate contact information, and it's not uncommon to have to go to court to fight tooth and nail just to get the people who you're supposed to be representing's contact information. So again, the point here is that these digital communication tools have restructured the balance of power. I think maybe the culmination of this and what is maybe the most trying to think of a polite word of saying this, but the most challenging or problematic form of work for organized labor is gig work. All of the same issues that we mentioned previously are amplified under gig work. You have an incredibly isolated group of workers who entirely rely on digital and algorithmic tools with no human input and are again subject to all the obfuscation that normal workers are. But it's also a little bit worse than that, because through leveraging their algorithmic management tools, companies like DoorDash, Lyft, and Uber are allowed to reconfigure what it means to be employed. Now, workers are not seen as employees, but as independent contractors, which removes their legal right to unionize. Numerous states have started to fight back against this. Massachusetts is also leading the charge. We just passed a right for gig workers to unionize if they're working, if it's like 20 or 30 hours per week. So there is progress being made, but it's still a pretty rough picture for organized labor. So what do? I've painted a pretty dark picture, and I'm not going to pretend and lie to you that the reality is looking like it's getting much better. But there are so many amazing and intelligent people working on this problem that I think there is hope. One answer, and an answer that I'm currently working to build off of, is from Jathan Sadowski, a social scientist. In his book, The Mechanic and the Luddite, he describes two different philosophical lenses or others we can think about when we're designing technology. The mechanic understands the inner workings of technological tools and can go in there and can reconfigure, twist them around. You might think, oh, how does that apply to technology? But maybe the most obvious example is AI. AI is famously black box. Workers have no idea what's going on when they input stuff. And this idea of the mechanic sort of shifts that. The other idea is the Luddite. Like I mentioned in the intro, Luddites understood technology in a broader social and economic or political economy context and the role that technology played in their broader labor disputes. The Luddite knows when to say no. And when it comes to worker privacy, we need to have the ability to say no. Workers need to be able to opt out of excessive surveillance mechanisms at work if they want to be able to leverage their right to unionize. What this might look like then as an alternative for designing technology is, again, still a little bit of an open question. Come back to me in a year or two after these other papers are finished. But one of the ideas or frameworks is through participatory design. Originally developed in the 80s, participatory design shifts the balance of power when designing the use cases of technology by engaging in discussions with all of the stakeholders. So this is a great example by some friends of friends in which, recognizing the issue that scheduling algorithms had on worker sustainability, they developed a tool in conversation with both employers and workers to ensure that employers' needs were met, but workers also had significantly more agency over making sure that their working hours were regulated and so that they could plan their lives accordingly. Both sides reported significant improvements on this, but I think the important point is that they're engaging in discussions of design that embrace all of the stakeholders when it comes to technology. So I think, in conclusion, what we really need in this moment, if we want to revitalize American labor, is to recognize that technology, much like the Luddites, is not this single directional vector of progress, but instead something that is a social context. Social contexts build technology and they affect how we use it. More specifically, I think technology reconfigures and reconstructures power. And if we want to create an economy that is equitable and works for all of us, we need to recognize this and use that as a source of power. Thank you.